Right, so welcome back to Adventure 82 from West Whitton. So it's October now, and if you've probably remember from last year, I did a few dark stories. It was all in one video though. There was 3 different stories in the one video. This year I'm going to do a couple local ones to the Richmondshire district of North Yorkshire, but this one's one I was been promising people for a while. So this one's actually from my birth home of Jersey. So without any further ado, here's the video you've all been waiting for on the Newell murders. Exit stage left. Right, so for those of you who aren't aware or haven't heard of the Newell murders before, they occurred in 1987 over in the small island where I was born in Jersey. The 2 victims were Elizabeth Newell, who was a school teacher at the time, and her husband Nicholas Newell. I can't seem to find out what he was actually doing at the time as a job, but I have found out that he aspired to be a children's author at the time, and he had actually written 2 books but failed to get them published. The plan was for their sons Roderick and Mark to come over from the mainland and stay over with them for the weekend, and then go off and have a meal to celebrate their wedding anniversary. Roderick arrived on the Friday evening, and Mark was already in Jersey at the time, so Mark went with his father Nicholas to pick up a van they'd hired to sort out some stuff in the attic. He also said he'd help his dad sort out some attic on the Friday that Roderick arrived. So they'd been to do that, and there was bits and pieces they cleared out from the attic. Some of it was in the van, some of it was still in the house, which will become appropriately needed later information. But we start our story, now you have the background, on the Saturday evening as they're preparing to go for their wedding anniversary meal. Right, so our story continues from the Saturday evening. So around 8 o'clock in the evening, 8 p.m, they started their celebrations quite jolly and joyful, as you'd imagine for a wedding anniversary. They popped open 2 bottles of champagne. Nicholas and Elizabeth were there drinking those with their sons, quite happy. An hour later, all 4 of them left the house, went down to the Seacrest restaurant and had their meal. I had some more champagne, some liqueur, the kind of thing you would expect to happen at a family gathering for a special event. And then they turned around and they went home again. But this is where everything started to go wrong. So at some point during the evening, once they'd got back home after the meal, an argument broke out between Nicholas and his eldest son Roderick over Roderick's career, or as Nicholas saw it, their lack of. Roderick didn't take this so well, and the 2 men drinking clearly didn't help matters. Things started to escalate, get very loud, very rowdy. Mark at this point decided to go home because he wanted nought to do with it. But things carried on escalating after Mark went home between Roderick and Nicholas, and things then started getting physical. And Nicholas pushed Roderick. Roderick smacked his head as he fell from being pushed on the edge of a table, and in retaliation he picked up something that they'd brought down from the attic, or Nicholas had brought down earlier from the attic with Mark, and smacked his dad full pelt across the head with it. And this was the last thing that Roderick remembered until the following morning, when the full devastation of Roderick's rage, because that was just the beginning, was seen by Roderick's eyes for the first time. Right, so following morning, Roderick wakes up, and next to him is his dead father. Then Roderick starts to freak out, so he goes to check on his mother. His mother's got no pulse either. It turns out that what Roderick had actually done that night, completely drunk to the point he hadn't remembered, is when he'd reached into that box to pick up whatever it was that was to go into the van, what he'd picked up is some rice flails which he used in martial arts, and he clubbed his dad to death with them across the head. But then he'd gone and done the same thing to his mother, which he completely didn't remember. In a state of panic, Roderick then phoned his brother Mark and explained to Mark what had happened and that his parents were dead. Mark then turned up at the house to talk to Roderick. He came with a shotgun, which I don't understand what the point of Mark turning up with a shotgun was, but he turned up with a shotgun. I think it might have been something that Roderick had an idea for, because when Roderick spoke to Mark about it, Mark suggested he phone the police, explain what had happened, and go from there. Roderick was adamant the police would not understand the situation, that his plan indeed was to just shoot himself, and that was problem solved. Mark convinced him that wasn't the solution, however, and then the two devised on a plan instead to cover it up. So what they did is they went down to the boiler room and to the shed in their parents' house at Clos de l'Atlantique. They got some tarpaulin, some tools, some cleaning equipment that they needed, and then they wrapped up their parents in the tarpaulin, took them down to Grève de Lac, just on the north coast of Jersey. They dug them a 2 to 3 inch deep shallow grave, 2 to 3 feet inch deep shallow grave, put their parents in, buried them, went back, and then started cleaning up the house and try and remove all trace of all the evidence. But things only started to get trickier from there, because as you can imagine, his mother was a teacher, so she had many friends, and Nicholas wasn't short of friends either. And the following morning, after they'd done all this and they'd buried their parents, at 8:45 in the morning, a lady called Maureen came to call with flowers for his mother, Elizabeth. And Roderick said that his parents were both asleep, but he took the flowers in for her. Right, so the day after Maureen called, Roderick was back in the UK, because the evening before he'd caught his plane, gone back to the UK, and as far as Roderick was concerned, it was all done and dusted, everything should be fine. But it wasn't. Maureen got suspicious after 2 days of not hearing from her friend and reported these suspicions to the police, who went and knocked on the door, then themselves getting no response. And then they had a look around the house, and they got quite concerned when it looked like that nothing had been touched for a while. So the police quickly got access to the house and found reasonably quickly that the parents had been murdered when they did forensic tests around the house to try and figure out what happened, where these people had gone missing. They found blood splatter on the walls, which led them to questioning, obviously, the two sons. Mark, who was still in Jersey at the time, and then Roderick, who was back in the UK, was questioned as well. But there was no solid evidence. Although the police had their suspicions, they learnt that the parents had been buried with a spade that was bought at Norman's by the sons. They learnt that the parents had been wrapped up in tarpaulin that had also been bought from Norman's, a local builder's merchant in the island of Jersey, by the sons, but they couldn't prove the sons had done anything. So in 1989, the end of 1989, the house was given back to the family, and in 1991 their parents were declared dead, but with no solid proof as to what happened to them. Mark phoned and told Roderick this, but the police weren't entirely honest in the fact that they weren't done investigating. So in 1992, the Scottish police, trying to help Jersey, put Roderick under surveillance. And it was whilst he was under surveillance, they bugged a hotel room, and they set up a meeting between Roderick and his uncle Stephen, Nicholas's twin brother. And it was during this meeting that they learnt things that they didn't know. Right, so the things they learnt were that the parents, which they kind of suspected, but this was confirmed now, that the parents had been wrapped in plastic and they had been then camouflaged. But that's kind of all they knew, because Roderick was kind of skating around it, not really giving specifics, nothing enough to incriminate him. The Scottish police did want to arrest him and question him further to get more out of him, but were unable to do so because they needed a warrant from the Jersey police, being that Roderick was a Jersey citizen. Roderick managed to lose the police again for a while as well, because as the Scottish police were tailing him down the M6, Roderick noticed and he managed to give them the slip. And it was at this point that he managed to sneak off and get to his boat and hightail it to France. So the investigation continued, but without knowing where Roderick was, all the police had left was to focus on Mark. So Mark, by this point, had moved from the island of Jersey and was currently working in Paris, the police learned in 1992. So they started keeping a close eye, a very close eye, the French police did, on Mark. And it was at this point that they learned of a meeting that Mark was having in Paris with his brother Roderick. Right, so it was at this meeting in Paris between Mark and Roderick at the Tangiers the police learnt one piece of information that they'd been looking for. Where the hell was Roderick hiding? Roderick, it turns out, when he hightailed it in his boat, didn't exactly go straight to France, which is what the police first anticipated he'd done. What he was actually doing is he was living out at sea on his boat, somewhere between France and Gibraltar, because he was moving a bit each day. But by the summer, the end coming towards the beginning of August of 1992, the Royal Navy, who had been sent out to keep an eye out for Roderick to try and figure out where at sea he was, caught up with Roderick. They wouldn't have been suspicious of Roderick's boat ordinarily, apart from the fact that Roderick was flying the ensign flag on his boat. Now, if you're not familiar with what the ensign flag is, it's a British Marine flag that identifies your boat as British. So normally in the seas where Roderick was hiding between France and Gibraltar, you primarily see Spanish or French boats. You wouldn't normally see a British boat, let alone a British yacht, in these waters. So at the end, this, like I say, at the back end of July 1992, the Royal Navy went and investigated this boat that was flying the British flag, and indeed it was Roderick's boat. At this point, Roderick was arrested, and he was held by the Gibraltar police for a year whilst they organised the paperwork to expedite him back to the island of Jersey. Whilst he was there, though, he was able to read the newspapers, watch the news, and keep track of what evidence and reports were saying about him and his arrest, which caused him to go on a hunger strike, which only lasted 4 days. However, there wasn't the last attempt that Roderick would make to escape his penalty for what he'd done to his parents. Upon hearing about the arrest of his brother, after, as we mentioned, having access to the newspapers and other media, Roderick decided to attempt suicide again. This time he was about as successful, really, as his hunger strike. What had happened was he'd had a needle, a syringe, snuck into him, hidden inside an orange. But the police found it, so it made little to no difference. And eventually, 5 years after his parents were originally murdered by him that evening, Roderick and Mark were being held where they should have been the entire time whilst they were on the run, in the island of Jersey. Right, so the brothers arrived in Jersey at different times. So Mark arrived back in Jersey in May and pleaded not guilty to murdering his parents, which we know now is correct. Roderick, due to paperwork and complications, didn't arrive back into the island until November of 1993. At which point, once he was arrived in Jersey, he was escorted by police back to Greve de Lec to show them exactly where his parents had been buried. And once the location had been found, the parents to be dug up, it was noted that the parents all this time had been just 500 yards from the house they lived in, where they were murdered 5 years prior. In 1994, the boys, both of them, for the first time were in the same place and not in prison, although be it only in court. Mark was sentenced to 20 months for being an accomplice to murder. Roderick was given 2 life sentences. However, he was released, bearing in mind that he was sentenced in 1994. He was released in 2007, doing about maybe half that, if you're lucky. And lives somewhere now in the UK with a completely different name. And the last I heard, the last mention of him is that he was working in IT. So, although they've been to prison, some would say that that's pretty much as close as you can get without literally not being arrested at all in getting away with murder. The only real consequence they had is that their house and inheritance was taken away from them, because it was a clearly well thought out, planned affair from beginning to finish after their parents were died, to try and cover the whole thing up. Do feel free to leave your comments in the bottom about what you think. I don't think that somebody who's murdered their parents should be released after only doing 13 years, regardless what the circumstances are. But obviously, like I say, there's different opinions, so I would love to hear yours. But from me, here at Adventure 82, and Erica hiding behind the camera, and the lovely cows behind me in the field, I'll see you next time, hopefully with something a bit more cheerful. Ta-ra!